Nebraska Territory, October 1872. The prairie wind cut across the empty grassland like a blade. 17 families had staked claims along the North Loup River that autumn, and every single one was racing against winter. Log cabins rose from the earth, walls chinked with clay, roofs of split shingles, stone chimneys climbing toward the sky. Every family except one. Lars Ericson wasn't building up. He was digging down. While his neighbors hauled timber and stacked logs, Ericson carved at the south face of a low hill with nothing but a spade and a pickaxe. They watched him disappear into the earth, day after day, emerging covered in dirt. The jokes started immediately. Digging his own grave, they said, that Norski's lost his mind. Even the children whispered about the madman who lived in a hole. But Ericson kept digging. What did this Norwegian homesteader understand about heat, about earth, about survival, that 17 families of experienced American settlers had completely missed? Before we go further, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to discover isn't just history. It's engineering wisdom that could save your life in a grid-down situation. And drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We read every single one. Now let's find out what happened when winter came to Custer County. Lars Ericson arrived in Nebraska Territory in late September 1872 with a wagon, 2 oxen, a wife, and 3 children under the age of 7. He was 41 years old. He'd worked stone quarries in Trondheim before immigrating, and he carried with him something the other settlers didn't have: memories of Gam, the traditional Norwegian semi-subterranean dwellings his grandparents had lived in. The other homesteaders were building what they knew: American frontier cabins. The Hendersons were raising a 12 by 16-foot structure of cottonwood logs. The Pratts had already completed their walls and were working on a plank roof. James Bradley, who'd homesteaded 2 years earlier and considered himself an expert on prairie survival, was helping 3 families with their chimneys. These were solid, proven designs. Log cabins had carried settlers across the Appalachians, through Missouri, into Kansas. This was the American way. Ericson's approach seemed insane by comparison. He selected a hillside that faced almost directly south, with a land sloped gently down toward a seasonal creek. He paced off a rectangle, 14 feet wide, 20 feet deep, and began to dig, not down in a flat ground, but horizontally into the hillside itself. He carved into the earth like a miner, throwing soil out behind him, creating a chamber that burrowed straight back into the hill. What in God's name is that man doing? Sarah Henderson asked her husband on the 3rd day. Building a root cellar, I suppose, Tom Henderson replied, though it's mighty large for storing turnips. But Ericson wasn't building a root cellar. He was building a home. By the 2nd week of October, the truth became obvious. Ericson had excavated a space roughly 14 feet wide, 20 feet deep, and 7 feet tall at the front, sloping down to 6 feet at the back. He'd removed approximately 16 tons of earth. The back and side walls were raw dirt, carefully carved and surprisingly smooth. The front wall, the only part exposed to the outside, he was now constructing from sod blocks cut from the prairie, stacked 3 feet thick. The neighbors were appalled. He's living like a damned animal, James Bradley told a group of homesteaders gathered at the Hendersons' half-finished cabin. My family didn't cross the ocean and survive the trail just to burrow into the ground like prairie dogs. It's the European way, Tom Henderson offered, though he sounded uncertain. Maybe they do things differently in Norway. Different doesn't mean smart, Bradley shot back. That earth will collapse on him come spring thaw. Mark my words, he'll be digging himself out of his own grave if he survives the winter at all. The women worried about different things. How could anyone keep a dirt house clean? What about moisture? Wouldn't the whole family get sick living underground, breathing damp air, never seeing proper sunlight? Young Martha Pratt, 19 and newly married, actually cried when she saw Ericson's 3 small children playing near the entrance of what she called that terrible hole. Those poor babies, she whispered. But Lars Ericson wasn't listening to the criticism. He'd heard it all before, back in Norway, from younger men who'd abandoned the old ways. He just kept working. He reinforced the front wall with vertical posts of cottonwood, set deep into the ground. He framed a doorway with salvaged lumber and hung a solid plank door with leather hinges. He cut a window opening and fitted it with 4 precious panes of glass he'd hauled all the way from Omaha. And then he did something that made even less sense to his neighbors. He gathered stones. Flat prairie limestone, hauled up from the creek bed. He mortared these stones into a small fireplace at the back left corner of his dugout, with a chimney that angled up through the earth and emerged from the hillside 8 feet above the entrance. The firebox itself was tiny, barely 18 inches across. "Look at that," Bradley scoffed when he saw it. Fireplace the size of a damn bread box. He'll freeze to death trying to heat that cave with a fire you couldn't roast a chicken over. October gave way to November. The other settlers completed their cabins. Proud structures with substantial fireplaces, stone chimneys, proper wooden floors raised on log joists. The Hendersons even had a sleeping loft. These were real homes, American homes, built the right way. Ericson's family disappeared into their hole in the ground. Smoke emerged from the tiny chimney. At night, lamplight glowed through the single window. The neighbors called him a fool. They had no idea what winter was about to teach them. What Lars Ericson had built was more sophisticated than anyone realized. While the other settlers saw only a hole in the ground, Ericson had engineered a structure based on principles that Norwegian and Sami peoples had refined over centuries. Earth as insulation, thermal mass as a heat battery, and strategic orientation toward the winter sun. The dimensions were deliberate. The 14-foot width provided adequate living space for a family of 5, while keeping the roof span manageable. The 20-foot depth drove the back wall far enough into the hillside that it sat surrounded by earth on 3 sides. Earth that remained at a constant temperature of roughly 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of surface conditions. The Ericsons were essentially living inside a natural temperature regulator. The front wall, constructed from prairie sod blocks, was 3 feet thick. Each block measured roughly 12 inches wide, 18 inches long, and 4 inches thick, cut from the dense root system of buffalo grass that had held this soil in place for thousands of years. Ericson had stacked these blocks in a running bond pattern, like bricklaying, creating a barrier that combined the insulating properties of earth with the structural integrity of stacked masonry. 3 feet of sod has an R value of approximately 20, comparable to 8 inches of modern fiberglass insulation. The roof was his masterwork. He laid cottonwood poles across the width of the dugout, spaced every 16 inches. Over these, he'd placed a layer of prairie hay, then a layer of smaller branches woven tight, then another layer of hay. Finally, he'd covered the entire structure with 18 inches of the same sod blocks he'd used for the front wall, grass side up. The living roots continued to grow, knitting the roof into a single weatherproof mass that weighed approximately 8 tons. That weight provided stability against prairie winds that regularly exceeded 50 miles per hour. But the real genius was in the heating system. The small limestone fireplace that James Bradley had mocked was positioned in the back left corner for specific reasons. First, by placing it at the rear of the dugout, Ericson ensured that smoke and heat had to travel the full length of the dwelling before exiting. Second, the limestone itself, approximately 400 pounds of dense rock, absorbed heat during the evening fire and radiated it back into the space for hours afterward. Third, the firebox was small by design. Ericson wasn't trying to heat the space directly with flame. He was using fire to charge the thermal mass of the surrounding earth and stone. The chimney angled upward at roughly 45 degrees, traveling 8 feet through earth and sod before emerging into open air. This passage through cold earth would have created a condensation problem in a conventional fireplace. But Ericson's small, hot fires generated enough draft to keep the flue clear while the earth around the chimney absorbed excess heat that radiated back into the living space. He'd also done something the other settlers hadn't noticed. He'd carved a shallow alcove around the fireplace area, creating a 3-foot deep recess filled with loose stones. During the day, sunlight entering through the south-facing window struck the earthen back wall, which absorbed heat. At night, when he lit his fire, the flames heated both the limestone fireplace and the surrounding earth that would release that stored warmth gradually over the next 12 to 16 hours. James Bradley, when he finally walked through the completed dugout in early November, couldn't hide his contempt. "You've built yourself a fancy root cellar, Ericson," he said, running his hand along the smooth earthen wall. "I'll grant you it's dry, for now. But come January, when the temperature drops below zero and stays there for a week, that little fire won't keep your family from freezing. You'll be burning twice the wood we use, trying to heat all this cold earth." Ericson just smiled. His English was limited, but he understood criticism in any language. "Earth not cold," he said, his accent thick. "Earth warm. Always warm." "It's dirt," Bradley replied. "Dirt is cold in winter." "You see," Ericson said simply. Sarah Henderson was more concerned about health. She'd visited once with her 2 daughters, bringing a loaf of bread as a welcoming gift, and she'd been surprised by how dry and clean the dugout felt. The earthen walls were smooth, almost polished. The packed earthen floor was covered with wooden planks near the fireplace and sleeping area. The ceiling was lined with muslin cloth to catch any dirt that might fall from between the roof poles. It was dark, certainly. The single window provided limited light, but it was far more substantial than she'd expected. Still, she worried. "Mrs. Ericson," she'd said, addressing Lars's wife Ingrid through gestures and slow English. "Aren't you afraid of cave-ins? Of the earth falling?" Ingrid had smiled and said something in Norwegian, then pointed to the walls, the ceiling, the cottonwood support posts. Her meaning was clear. This has stood for generations. This is strong. But Sarah Henderson remained unconvinced. She returned to her own cabin, a proper cabin with wooden walls and a stone hearth that James Bradley himself had helped her husband build, and thanked God her family would spend the winter in a civilized home. By late November, all 17 families were settled. Wood piles stood outside every cabin. Chimneys smoked daily as families tested their fireplaces and began the work of staying warm. The Hendersons' fireplace, built to James Bradley specifications, consumed a quarter quart of cottonwood every 3 days, a significant amount, but reasonable by frontier standards. The firebox was large enough to burn logs 2 feet long, generating substantial heat that filled their 12 by 16 cabin adequately, though the corners farthest from the hearth remained noticeably cooler. Lars Ericson burned 1 small armload of wood each evening, perhaps 1/8 of what the Hendersons used, and his dugout stayed warm enough that his family rarely wore coats indoors. The neighbors attributed this to the dugout being small, cramped, poorly ventilated. "He's probably suffocating in there," Bradley said. "No proper airflow. That's not warmth, that's stale air." November passed. December arrived with cold rain and occasional snow. The first real cold snap hit on December 18th. Temperatures dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. The Hendersons woke to frost on the inside of their window and had to rebuild their fire from banked coals, feeding it for an hour before the cabin became comfortable. Ericson's chimney barely smoked that morning. He'd burned his small evening fire, and that was apparently enough. "Damned fool's going to kill his family," Bradley muttered when he saw the lack of smoke. Probably too proud to admit he's freezing. But Lars Ericson wasn't freezing. He was warm, and he was waiting for winter to prove what 17 families of American settlers refused to believe, that sometimes the old ways, the ways that looked primitive and foolish, were engineered better than anything modern pride could build. January would teach them that lesson. The weather that had carried them through November and December was merely practice. Old-timers in the region would later call the winter of 1872 to 73 moderate by Nebraska standards. But for the 17 families on the North Loup River, the cold that arrived in the second week of January felt like the end of the world. It began on January 9th with a shift in the wind. The temperature had been holding steady in the mid-20s, cold, certainly, but manageable. Fires burned constantly, with supplies diminished, but families stayed warm. Then the wind swung out of the northwest, and the temperature started falling. January 10th, 18 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-afternoon. By evening, 9 degrees Fahrenheit. January 11th, 3 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. Below zero by nightfall. January 12th, -8 degrees Fahrenheit when Tom Henderson checked his thermometer at sunrise. The mercury would not rise above zero for the next 4 days. This was different from anything the newer settlers had experienced. The cold didn't just arrive, it occupied the land like an invading force. It crept through every crack in every wall. It turned the moisture in your breath to ice crystals before it left your mouth. It made metal tools too painful to touch with bare hands. It killed livestock that weren't properly sheltered. It tested every assumption about what was warm enough. The Henderson cabin consumed a half-cord of wood in those first 3 days. Tom Henderson had to visit his woodpile every 2 hours, day and night, carrying armloads of split cottonwood to feed the insatiable fireplace. Even burning constantly, the cabin's temperature hovered around 48 degrees Fahrenheit in the morning before the fire was rebuilt, rising to perhaps 58 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-afternoon when the flames were at their peak. The corners of the cabin, those spaces farthest from the hearth, dropped into the low 40s. Ice formed on the inside of the window every night. The children slept in the same bed, huddled under every blanket the family owned. Sarah Henderson wore 2 dresses and a coat indoors. The cabin was survival, but it was not comfort. The Pratts fared worse. Their cabin was larger, 16 by 20 feet, and their fireplace, though substantial, couldn't generate enough heat to warm the entire space. Martha Pratt, that young bride who had cried at the sight of Ericson's grave, now spent her days huddled within 3 feet of the flames, moving only when absolutely necessary. The back half of their cabin, where they stored supplies and food, remained below freezing. The water bucket near the door froze solid. But the real crisis was wood consumption. The Pratts were burning 3/4 of a cord every 4 days, nearly double what they'd anticipated. At this rate, their winter supply would last until late February at best. If the cold continued into March, they'd face a choice: burn their furniture or freeze. By January 14th, James Bradley was making rounds to the various homesteads, checking on families and assessing the situation. He was burning through wood at an alarming rate himself, and he could see the same panic in his neighbors' eyes. Several families were already rationing their fires, letting the temperature drop at night to conserve supply, then rebuilding larger fires in the morning. It was a miserable compromise between cold and desperation. Bradley visited 11 families that week. Every single cabin told the same story: struggling fireplaces, inadequate heat, dwindling wood supplies, and a growing fear of what would happen if this cold lasted. He did not visit Lars Ericson's dugout. He didn't need to. He could see from 200 yards away that something was very different about that hole in the ground. The tiny chimney barely smoked. Maybe an hour each evening, a thin trail of gray rising into the frozen air, then nothing. The rest of the time, silence. No massive wood consumption. No constant stoking. Just that single evening fire. He's either dead or dying, Bradley told the Henderson family on the evening of January 15th. He'd come to borrow an axe. His own had cracked in the cold, and found the Hendersons gathered around their fireplace, burning steadily. Nobody could survive this cold with one fire a day. Maybe he's burning at different times, Tom Henderson offered, though he sounded doubtful. Maybe we're just not seeing it. I've watched for 3 days, Bradley insisted. One fire. Evening only. Either he's the toughest son of a bitch in Nebraska, or he's frozen stiff in that hole and too stubborn to fall over. Sarah Henderson, who had more charity in her heart than most, said quietly, maybe we should check on them. Bring them food. See if they need help. Bradley scoffed. If that fool wants to prove he's smarter than everyone else, let him prove it. When he comes crawling out begging for shelter, then we'll know the truth. But Lars Ericson didn't come crawling out. On January 16th, Tom Henderson's curiosity finally overcame his pride. The temperature had been below zero for 5 straight days. His own family was burning wood faster than he could split it. His children had stopped playing because movement meant leaving the area near the fireplace. His wife's hands were cracked and bleeding from the dry cold inside their cabin. And that damn Norwegian's chimney still only smoked for 1 hour each evening. Something didn't make sense. If you want to know what Tom Henderson discovered when he finally knocked on Lars Ericson's door, hit that like button right now and make sure you're subscribed. because what he found inside that grave changed everything 17 families thought they knew about staying warm on the frontier. Drop a comment with your prediction. How warm do you think it was inside that dugout? We're reading every guess. Henderson walked the quarter mile to Ericson's homestead at mid-morning on the 16th. The temperature was -4 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was mercifully calm. His breath created clouds of ice crystals that hung in the air behind him. Every step across the frozen prairie sounded like breaking glass. He approached the dugout and immediately noticed something strange. No frost on the window. The Hendersons' cabin window accumulated thick frost every night, requiring scraping each morning to let in light. But Ericson's window was clear. He knocked. The door opened within seconds, releasing a wave of warm air that Tom Henderson felt on his face like a physical touch. Lars Ericson stood there in his shirt sleeves. No coat, no multiple layers, just a simple work shirt and canvas trousers. Behind him, Henderson could see his wife working at a small table. The children were playing on the floor. No one was huddled near the fireplace. In fact, the fireplace wasn't even burning. "Mr. Henderson," Ericson said, his accent thick but his smile genuine. "Come. It's cold outside." Tom Henderson stepped through the doorway and stopped. The difference was so extreme, so immediate, that he actually thought for a moment that he might have developed frostbite that was now burning as it thawed. But no, this was actual warmth. Deep, even surrounding warmth. "Good God," he whispered. "How warm is it in here?" Ericson didn't understand the English, but he understood the question. He gestured to a small thermometer hanging on the earthen wall, one of the few manufactured items visible in the space. The mercury read 62 degrees Fahrenheit. It was 62 degrees inside the dugout. The fireplace was cold, and outside, it was 4 degrees below zero. "Ow!" Henderson asked, almost pleading. How is this possible? What Tom Henderson was experiencing wasn't magic. It was physics, the same physics that had kept Norwegian families alive above the Arctic Circle for centuries, now applied to the Nebraska prairie by a man who'd been called a fool for understanding it. Lars Ericson walked Henderson to the back of the dugout and placed the American settler's hand flat against the earthen wall. Henderson expected it to feel cold, damp, unpleasant. Instead, it felt warm. Not hot, not uncomfortable, just consistently, noticeably warm. "Earth," Ericson said in his limited English. He gestured around them, at the walls, the ceiling, everything. "Earth hold heat. Always." He led Henderson to the small limestone fireplace. The stones were still warm to the touch, though the fire had been out since the previous evening, at least 12 hours. Ericson had burned perhaps 3 small logs, no more than an hour's worth of flame, and that heat had been absorbed by 400 pounds of limestone and the surrounding earth. Now, slowly, inevitably, that stored energy was radiating back into the living space. But the fireplace was only part of the story. Ericson took Henderson to the front window, that south-facing opening that let in what little winter sunlight Nebraska provided. Even on these brutal January days, the low winter sun shone directly through that window for several hours, and its light struck the back wall of the dugout. That earthen wall, dark and absorbent, soaked up every bit of solar radiation it received. The temperature rise from sunlight alone was modest, perhaps 5 or 6 degrees, but in combination with the residual heat from the evening fire and the constant 50 degrees Fahrenheit temperature of the earth surrounding the entire structure, it was enough. The dugout wasn't a single heat source fighting against cold. It was an integrated thermal system, the earth providing a baseline temperature that never dropped below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, the fireplace and stones adding concentrated heat that radiated slowly, the south-facing window capturing passive solar gain, and the mass of the structure itself, 16 tons of earth above and around them, acting as a giant heat battery that absorbed warmth during any heat input and released it gradually over time. Tom Henderson stood in the middle of that 14 by 20 space and tried to reconcile what he was experiencing with what he'd been taught. This went against everything civilized settlers believed about proper housing. A cabin should be above ground, built of timber, with a large fireplace and constant fire. That was the American way. That was progress. But progress was currently burning itself into bankruptcy, trying to maintain 48 degrees Fahrenheit, while this Norwegian fool was comfortable at 62 degrees Fahrenheit using 1/8 the wood. How much would you burn? Henderson asked. He held up fingers, trying to mime the question. Each day, each week. Ericson understood. He held up one hand, finger spread. 5. Then he gestured to a small pile of split wood near the fireplace. Perhaps 3 armloads total. 5 days, Henderson said, understanding. That much would last you 5 days. Ericson nodded. 5 days. Ja. The Hendersons were burning that much wood in half a day. Henderson felt something crack in his chest. Not his ribs, but his pride. He dismissed this man. They'd all dismissed him. Called him a madman, a fool, a crazy European who didn't understand American frontier life. And all the while, Lars Ericson had been living in more comfort, with more safety, with less work than any of them. I need to tell the others, Henderson said, though he knew Ericson couldn't fully understand. They need to see this. By that evening, 7 men had visited the Ericson dugout. James Bradley came last, reluctantly, after the others had returned to their cabins with expressions that mixed wonder and shame. Bradley stood in the warmth of that underground space for 10 minutes, his mind working through everything he thought he knew about architecture and heating and survival. It shouldn't work, he finally said. Not to Ericson. The Norwegian wouldn't understand the English, but to himself, as if saying it aloud might make it less true. The earth should conduct the cold. The moisture should freeze. The small fireplace should be inadequate. But it did work. The evidence surrounded him. 3 children playing without coats, a wife cooking without shivering, a man who'd used a fraction of the wood that American cabins consumed, maintaining a temperature 14 degrees higher than the best cabin in the settlement. Bradley touched the earthen wall. It was warm. He checked the window. No frost. He examined the small fireplace with its modest pile of ash. He looked at the ceiling. 8 tons of sod and earth and grass, held up by cottonwood poles, completely solid, completely dry. Ow, he asked Ericson. How did you know? Ericson smiled. He spoke in Norwegian, a long explanation that Bradley couldn't understand. But the meaning came through in gestures, old country, old ways, generations of families who'd lived underground when the land above was too harsh, too cold, too deadly. What Lars Ericson was saying, in essence, was this: my people have been doing this for 1,000 years. We learned the truth that you're just now discovering. The earth is not your enemy. The earth is your blanket. And if you build correctly, if you work with the land instead of against it, if you use the thermal mass that exists beneath your feet, you don't need to burn forests to stay alive. You just need to be smart enough to listen to those who came before. Bradley left the dugout without another word. He walked back to his own cabin, a fine cabin, an American cabin, built the right way, and fed his fireplace another armload of wood. The temperature inside was 51 degrees Fahrenheit. His family huddled near the flames. That night, the temperature dropped to -14 degrees Fahrenheit. The Hendersons burned through an entire quarter cord of wood trying to keep their cabin above 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Martha Pratt cried herself to sleep, terrified that their wood supply wouldn't last until spring. For families were already discussing what furniture they could burn if necessary. And in the dugout on the hillside, Lars Ericson burned his small evening fire, 3 logs, 1 hour of flame, then banked the coals and went to bed. His family slept in comfort. The limestone radiated heat through the night. The earth held them in warmth. The difference between the coldest cabin and the Ericson dugout that night was 42 degrees Fahrenheit. 42 degrees that separated misery from comfort, survival from thriving, pride from wisdom. The cold snap broke on January 21st. The temperature climbed back above zero, then into the teens, then the 20s. By the end of the month, Nebraska was experiencing almost spring-like conditions, mid-30s during the day, mild winds, occasional sun. The crisis had passed, but something had fundamentally changed among the 17 families on the North Loup River. Tom Henderson was the first to admit it publicly. On January 28th, during a Sunday gathering at the Pratt's cabin, a social tradition the settlers maintained even in harsh weather, He stood and addressed the group. "I need to say something," Henderson began, his weathered hands gripping a tin cup of coffee. "For 3 months, we've been calling Lars Ericson a fool. I was one of the loudest voices saying he'd made a mistake building that dugout. I want to publicly apologize for my ignorance." A murmur went through the room. Admitting error was not common among frontiermen, especially in front of neighbors who'd all shared the same opinion. Henderson continued, "During that cold snap, my family burned 4 cords of wood in 2 weeks. For cords, we maintained temperatures between 45 and 55 degrees, and we nearly froze doing it. Lars Ericson burned less than 1 cord in the same period and maintained temperatures above 60. That's not luck. That's not magic. That's engineering." James Bradley, who'd been sitting silently near the fireplace, finally spoke. "It's Earth," he said quietly. "The man built a thermal battery." Several settlers looked confused. Bradley, despite his earlier dismissal of Ericson's methods, had a technical mind that couldn't deny empirical results. "The Earth around the dugout stays at roughly 50 degrees year-round," Bradley explained, his tone that of a teacher rather than a critic. "In summer, that's cooling. In winter, that's heating. Everything below about 6 feet of depth maintains that constant temperature." Ericson didn't build a cabin that fights against the cold. He built a structure that uses the Earth's own temperature as a foundation, then adds just enough heat to raise it to comfortable levels. "The fireplace," Henderson added, "is small because it doesn't need to heat the space from 0 degrees to 60. It only needs to add 10 or 12 degrees to what the Earth is already providing. And the limestone stores that heat, releasing it slowly. It's brilliant." Sarah Henderson spoke next, her voice gentle but firm. "And it's clean. I thought living in Earth would be dirty, damp, unhealthy. But the Ericson home is drier than our cabin. There's no condensation, no moisture problems. The Earth breathes, somehow, managing humidity naturally. It's because the Earth wicks moisture away," Bradley said. He'd been thinking about this for days, working through the physics. "In our cabins, moisture from cooking and breathing has nowhere to go except onto cold surfaces, where it freezes. In the dugout, moisture moves into the earthen walls and is carried away through the soil itself. It's natural ventilation." The discussion continued for over an hour. Questions emerged. Could they build similar structures? Was it too late to start? Would a dugout work on flat land? Or did it require a hillside? What about flooding? What about structural integrity over time? Lars Ericson, who'd been invited but sat quietly in the corner throughout the discussion, finally stood. His English was limited, but he'd been following the conversation through tone and gesture. "Next year," he said slowly, carefully, "I help. You want. I teach. We build." It wasn't a grand speech. Ericson wasn't a man of words, but it was an offer of knowledge, freely given, to people who'd mocked him for months. The response was immediate. 5 families expressed interest in building dugouts or partially subterranean structures the following year. James Bradley, setting aside his pride entirely, asked if he could document Ericson's design, measurements, angles, material choices, everything. He wanted to create plans that others could follow. By late February, word had spread beyond the immediate settlement. Homesteaders from 15 miles away started visiting Ericson's dugout, seeing for themselves this grave that had outperformed every American cabin in the region. The Norwegian immigrant, who'd spoken perhaps 50 words of English in total since arriving, found himself hosting tours of his home, demonstrating with gestures and broken phrases how the fireplace worked, how the roof was constructed, how the south-facing window captured solar heat. The transformation in community attitude was remarkable. 3 months earlier, Lars Ericson had been the settlement's joke, the crazy foreigner who didn't understand American ways. Now, he was the settlement's expert, the man who'd brought knowledge from an older, harder land and adapted it successfully to Nebraska. But Ericson didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply helped. When spring came and families began planning their next structures, Ericson walked properties with them, helping select hillsides with proper southern exposure, testing soil for stability, advising on dimensions and depth. He showed them how to reinforce earthen walls, how to construct proper drainage, how to build chimneys that would draw correctly even when traveling through Earth. By late 1873, 17 months after Ericson had arrived and begun digging into that hillside, 11 new earth-sheltered structures had been built within a 50-mile radius of the North Loos settlement. Not all were full dugouts. Some were soddies with earth bermed against 3 walls and conventional roofs. Others were partially subterranean, dug into hillsides, but with more window space than Ericson's original design. Each builder adapted the concept to their specific needs and location. But every single one of them used the same core principle: work with the Earth's thermal mass instead of fighting against it. The results were consistent. Earth-sheltered homes in the region used 60 to 70% less firewood than conventional cabins while maintaining higher interior temperatures. They were more stable in high winds, a crucial advantage on the prairie. They required less maintenance, as earth didn't rot or weather like timber, and they proved surprisingly pleasant to live in, with stable temperatures, low noise, and natural humidity control. By 1875, when a journalist from Omaha visited the North Loos settlements to write about frontier life, he included a paragraph about the unusual prevalence of earth-sheltered homes in the region. He attributed this to Scandinavian influence and practical adaptations to harsh climate. He was half right. It was Scandinavian influence. But more than that, it was the influence of a single man who'd understood something fundamental, that dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often revealed not the ignorance of those who practiced it, but the arrogance of those who mocked it. The story of Lars Ericson's dugout could have ended as a local curiosity, a footnote in the settlement history of Custer County, Nebraska. But what happened on the North Lou River in the winter of 1872 to 73 represented something larger than one Norwegian immigrant proving his neighbors wrong. It was a collision between two ways of thinking about survival, about progress, about what constitutes wisdom. The American settlers who'd mocked Ericson weren't stupid. They were experienced frontiersmen who'd crossed the Missouri, staked claims, survived their first Nebraska year. They knew how to build cabins, raise crops, read weather. They carried with them generations of knowledge accumulated in Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, knowledge that had successfully moved an entire civilization westward across a continent. But that knowledge had boundaries. It was knowledge adapted to forests, to regions where timber was abundant and earth was viewed primarily as something to build upon, not within. The American cabin, that proud symbol of frontier self-reliance, was engineered for a specific environment. When that environment changed, when the Great Plains presented challenges of scarce timber, extreme temperature swings, and brutal winds, the old solutions suddenly became inefficient. Lars Ericson brought different knowledge. Not better in every context, but better for this context. His GAM tradition came from a land where winter wasn't just cold, it was deadly. Where resources weren't just scarce, they were non-existent for months at a time. Where the difference between clever building and foolish building was measured in lives, not comfort. Norwegian and Sami peoples had learned, over centuries, that the earth itself was the most reliable insulator, the most stable heat source, the most dependable shelter. What the North Loos settlers experienced in January 1873 was the moment when two knowledge systems met, and pride had to yield to evidence. James Bradley later wrote in a letter to his brother in Ohio, "I have lived 47 years believing that a man who builds his home underground is either desperate or ignorant. I now know that a man who refuses to build underground, when the land demands it, is the ignorant one. The Norski I mocked has taught me more about engineering in 3 months than I learned in 20 years of frontier building." That admission, painful as it must have been for a proud man to write, captured something essential. The frontier wasn't just a place where individuals proved their toughness. It was a laboratory where different approaches to survival competed, and the approaches that worked, regardless of their origin, deserved respect. By 1880, earth shelter construction had become common throughout western Nebraska and eastern Wyoming. The designs evolved. Some builders created hybrid structures with earth-bermed walls and conventional roofs. Others dug full dugouts like Ericson's. Still others built soddies that used prairie sod as primary building material above ground. But all of them incorporated the core principle: use the Earth's thermal stability as a foundation, then add only the supplementary heat necessary to reach comfort. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, in an 1886 bulletin on prairie homesteading, included a section on earth shelter construction. The language was careful, almost defensive. While such structures may appear crude to those accustomed to timber frame houses, practical experience has demonstrated their superior thermal efficiency in regions of temperature extremes and limited fuel supply. Even official acknowledgement carried the undertone of reluctance. These homes worked, but they challenged assumptions about what civilized housing should look like. Lars Ericson himself lived in his hillside dugout for 11 years. In 1883, having proven his homestead claim and achieved some financial stability, he built a conventional timber frame house nearby. It was larger, had more windows, stood above ground in the manner his neighbors had always preferred. But he kept the dugout, used it for storage initially, then as a workshop, and, according to family accounts, as a retreat during the coldest winter nights. Even with a modern house available, Ericson recognized that his grave remained the warmest, most comfortable space on his property. His children remembered the dugout fondly. In interviews conducted in the 1930s, when they were elderly themselves, they described it as cozy, safe, quiet. You couldn't hear the wind, his daughter Anna recalled. Outside, the prairie wind would howl like wolves. Inside, silence. Just the crackling of the fire, if father had lit one. We slept warm every night. I didn't know until years later that other families were suffering. The broader lesson of the Ericson dugout extends beyond thermal engineering. It speaks to the danger of conflating traditional with primitive, of assuming that newer methods are inherently superior to older ones, of dismissing knowledge systems we don't understand simply because they differ from our own experience. The American settlers on the North Loup River had built their cabins using the best information available to them, information refined over generations of westward expansion. But that information wasn't universal. It was contextual, and when context changed, flexibility became survival. Lars Ericson didn't invent earth-sheltered housing. He didn't even significantly modify it. He simply remembered what his ancestors had known, adapted it to new geography, and persisted when others mocked him. His genius wasn't innovation, it was humility. The humility to trust that solutions developed over centuries might have value, even when they looked strange to contemporary eyes. This matters now, perhaps more than ever. We live in an age that celebrates innovation while often dismissing tradition as obsolete. We assume that newer technologies automatically outperform older techniques, that indigenous knowledge is quaint but impractical, that progress moves in only one direction. The story of Lars Ericson's dugout suggests otherwise. Sometimes the best solution to a problem isn't the newest one. Sometimes it's the oldest one, waiting patiently to be remembered. Sometimes what looks like a grave is actually salvation. If this story changed how you think about traditional knowledge and frontier engineering, do 3 things right now. First, hit that subscribe button. We've got dozens more stories about survival wisdom that modern society has forgotten. Second, smash that like button so YouTube knows this content matters. Third, drop a comment telling us, what traditional technique from your culture or region do you think modern society should rediscover? Maybe it's a building method, a food preservation technique, a water management system. We want to hear it. The best comments might become future episodes. The North Loup River flows through Nebraska today, much as it did in 1872. The original Ericson dugout collapsed sometime in the 1920s. Earth structures require maintenance, and once abandoned, they return to the land quickly. But the knowledge didn't collapse. It spread, evolved, and influenced generations of prairie builders who learned that sometimes the wisest course is to work with the land rather than against it. Lars Ericson died in 1891 at age 60. He's buried in a small cemetery near his homestead. The inscription on his stone, placed there by his children, reads simply, "He built well." It's an understated epitaph for a man who changed how an entire region thought about shelter. But perhaps understatement was appropriate. Ericson never sought recognition. He never wrote books or gave lectures or claimed superiority. He just dug into a hillside, built a home that worked, and quietly endured the mockery until winter proved him right. In the end, that's all any of us can do. Hold to what we know is true, work diligently, and trust that evidence will speak louder than prejudice. The earth held Lars Ericson's family warm through that brutal winter of 1872 to 73. The earth holds his body now, and the lesson he taught, that wisdom doesn't always announce itself with trumpets, that sometimes the best answer is buried beneath assumptions we're too proud to question. That lesson remains, waiting for anyone humble enough to learn it. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more forgotten frontier wisdom. And remember, the next time someone calls an old technique primitive, ask yourself, are they measuring its effectiveness or just their own prejudice?